Ladies and gentlemen, Krzysztof the Polish Geek, and welcome to another video about Resident Evil 4. More specifically, I will really discuss which one actually is better, Resident Evil 4 Remake or the original from 2005, and in some ways will also be a review because I've played the remake first, but then I've played original and then I've beaten the remake again and original again, and I have to say I loved the remake the first time I beaten it, but after I've beaten both remake and the original twice, I've got a much bigger appreciation for both of those video games. I remember when I did my top 10 favorite video games of 2023, Resident Evil 4 Remake was my number 7, but I really regret it because I think it should be much higher on the list. Not number 1, that's still Lies of P, but it should be the top 5, or even maybe even in the top 3. But I really regret I put in Resident Evil 4 Remake only at number 7. But both Remake and Original are magnificent games, but only one of them I think truly deserves a title of an outright masterpiece. Both fabulous, phenomenal games, but we will now delve deep which one truly deserves a title of the masterpiece. Because first, see the remake, the original, although after I beaten the original on PS4, I also decided to get a PS2 version because honestly, playing it on the PS2 feels far more authentic, in all honesty. But now we'll discuss both remake and the original. Again, both amazing, phenomenal games. But which one truly deserves a title of an outright masterpiece? But before we actually start comparing both versions of this magnificent game, let's discuss Resident Evil 4 in general, because this game is simply magnificent, both versions of it. Which one is a true masterpiece? That's what you'll find out at the end of the video. But now let's talk about what makes both of those games magnificent. And the first thing I'll talk about, I really like the story of this game. It's a decidedly a scary horror story, but as I was playing it, I realized this is also very much a science fiction story too. All those zombies and weird monsters that you see, it might be shocking, but they're actually not a result of magic or anything. Magic is not really a thing in this game, and I heard it's not really a thing in Resident Evil in general, but it's most certainly not a thing in this game. All those weird monsters and all that you see are very much results of biological experiments, and this is really interesting. So this is both a science fiction game and a horror game. And I also, as I said, I really like the story of this game, and Leon Kennedy is a really amazing protagonist, and he instantly became one of my favorite video game protagonists after I beaten both versions of this game.
No thanks, bro.
I also really love the overall scary atmosphere of this game, as well as the level design and the environments. And also, I know that Resident Evil 4 was a very revolutionary game for its time. Now, this mostly admittedly applies to the original, because the remake, you can't really call it revolutionary, but original was very revolutionary for its time. And if it wasn't for Resident Evil 4, many of our favorite video game franchises would most certainly not exist, because as I was playing original Resident Evil 4, I realized that many of my favorite video games that I love so much would certainly not exist without Resident Evil 4. As you're playing this game, you can totally see that influence on many of the future video games that came after it is very much there. And you know what else? It also made me curious to check out other Resident Evil games. The only other Resident Evil game besides Resident Evil 4, both remake and original, that I played was Resident Evil 2 Remake. But now that really made me want to try many of the other video games in this franchise. Although I've heard Resident Evil 4 is the best in the franchise, and I wouldn't be surprised, honestly. It's hard to top something like this. And now that we overall talked about the magnificence of Resident Evil 4 in general, let's now decide which one truly deserves the title of the champion, which one truly deserves to be called an outright masterpiece of the two video games.
Story of my life.
The big aspect where Remake most certainly wins with the original is the graphics and art. And I'm not saying that graphics in the original are bad, quite the opposite. I still think they're amazing and hold up very well to this day. But, objectively, the more detailed and realistic graphics of the remake are simply just better. But it's normal, because the remake is a modern game then made in 2023. Of course, it's going to look better than a game made all the way back in 2005 on PS2 and GameCube. So again, graphics and the visuals are still great in the original, but with the remake being modern, of course, it's going to have more realistic and detailed graphics. So both games have amazing graphics and visuals, but Remake wins with the original in terms of visuals, graphics and art. Although we do have to keep in mind, sometimes looking better isn't enough to make the overall game better. When we talk about the gameplay though, things are a little more complicated. I don't think gameplay in the remake is necessarily better, but it's certainly much more accessible. It took me a little time to actually get used to gameplay of the original after I beat in the remake. During my first mission while I was playing original, I almost felt like I was fighting with the controls at first. Thankfully, I quickly got a hang of them, and afterwards it became pretty fun and easily playable for me, and I had a really great time, but I do know many people could be turned off by old controls like that. Original has a more fixed camera, for example, while Remake plays much more easily. And also, in the original, when you start shooting, you kind of have to stop, while in the Remake, you can easily shoot while running and walking. So, while I personally think original gameplay is still great and plays wonderfully for me, it's kind of very much an acquired taste, while Remake has certainly far more accessible gameplay. So, for that reason alone, I will go with the Remake again, just because the gameplay is more accessible to more gamers. And speaking of gameplay, I will also talk about one individual detail that I think is also slightly better in the remake, and that's
Too slow.
a boss battle with Jack Krauser. And in the original, at least the first phase of the fight is nothing more than a quick time event, while in the remake it's an actual boss battle full knife fight. I much prefer to actually combat the boss as opposed to just few button mashing. So another score for the remake, but admittedly a pretty small score because you do fight him overall in the original and it's a pretty awesome boss fight. It's just that in the remake you also have a full knife fight with him in the first phase. And on the other hand, at the same time, there are actually two individual details that I very much prefer in the original. And the first one is that there is an extra boss in the original that is missing from the remake. That's U3. And another awesome thing that's missing in the remake is this really cool laser room, which is such a cool moment and shows how awesome and badass Leon is. Okay, so right now it probably seems like I'm only giving points to the remake, but where I think the original easily wins is the nature of the game itself. Original certainly is very much a science fiction horror, just like the remake, and it is very creepy and dark, but remake removed all the campiness and cheese of the original, and as a result, it is much more serious and dark. But I have to say, I actually prefer the campiness of the original. While I haven't played original in the past, so I can't say I'm nostalgic for it like some people most certainly are, but I certainly am nostalgic for old days of the PlayStation 2, where video games in general have been much more campy and over the top. And maybe because of that nostalgia of those days, I prefer campy nature of the original. Plus, the voice acting for Leon, Ashley, and characters in general is simply fabulous. Those voice actors are irreplaceable.
I'm never turning into one of them. Never.
Got that right. We'll find a cure.
Me llamo Ramon Salazar, the 8th Castellan of this magnificent architecture.
Important thing that has to be talked about, and one that gives original a huge advantage, is also how different gaming is now to how it was back in 2005. In 2005, Resident Evil 4 was an innovative, revolutionary game that set a new standard for gaming. Gameplay was so amazing and innovative that it basically inspired a lot of other franchises we now know and love. On the other hand, Resident Evil 4 Remake is hailed as a much better game because of more realistic and bigger and more serious. And while those aren't necessarily bad reasons to think it's better, in my opinion, it also shows how we all became spoiled by modern gaming, and how many people don't want to touch old gems from the past, even when they truly deserve our love and attention. Resident Evil 4 Remake is a magnificent game, and I love its realistic look and more accessible gameplay and the more detailed and realistic environments. But at the end of the day, for me, it just serves as a supplement for the original, which I think still holds up amazingly well. I see many people arguing that other people only prefer original due to nostalgia goggles, and that could be the case. But as I've been saying, I actually played the remake first. So same way you can argue that people have been so spoiled by modern gaming and modern realistic graphics and the bigger means better mentality, that's why they hail remake as better. You probably heard some dedicated gamers saying how era of PlayStation 2 was the best era for gaming, and Resident Evil 4 is a perfect example of that. It's a perfect example of a game of that time, and as you're playing it, you totally see why people often hail PlayStation 2 as the best consoles ever. It just reminds you of the days where video game companies truly cared for fans and actually making good quality video games. Another thing where I think original easily wins with the remake is the overall story and the characters. It's pretty much the same story, but some details are changed, and I have to be honest, I think most details in the original are better. First thing I have to talk about is Leon himself. I still think he's a great protagonist in the remake, but I just love his catchy one-liners in the original. But far bigger downgrade though is the main villain, Osmond Saddler. In the original, Saddler was very much an evil villain fully in control of his actions. But here in the remake, they made him so boring, and there is a strong implication that his personality has actually been corrupted by some higher force and he isn't even fully in control of his actions. I really hate that. I think Saddler works much better as an evil villain that you just want to defeat. I really don't like that they made him basically less evil. In the original, Saddler was this power-hungry cult leader, and it was even hard to tell if he even believed the things he preached through his cult, or if he simply used it all for power. But in the remake, someone already said that they basically turned him into a generally cult leader, but I think even that's actually putting it very lightly. Remake basically makes you feel like he's been corrupted by some stronger force, and as I've been saying, he isn't even fully in control of his actions. Of all the characters, I think Osmond Saddler has been by far the biggest downgrade. As I was playing the remake, I barely cared about defeating him at all. As I said, he came off to me as a generally cult leader at first. But as I later played the original, I was so looking forward to putting the bastard down, and in the remake he even got a lot less screen time. That necessarily wouldn't be a bad thing if they made him actually creepy and far more mysterious, but as I already said, he's been turned from an evil, power-hungry maniac to nothing more than a generic cult leader whom we hardly even know is in full control of his actions. The other villain, Salazar, was also a downgrade. He also got a lot less screen time, and in the original I really liked how he was scheming and all, but here he was actually in the remake far more annoying. And similar with Jack Krauser. In the original, Jack Krauser works for Albert Wesker, a villain of all the other Resident Evil games. While I haven't played others, with the exception of the remake of the second game, I still think having a villain that connects to other parts works great. Making Jack just a loyal servant of Osmond Sadler doesn't really work for me. I very much prefer him to be an agent of Albert Wesker. There is only one character whom I do think is better in the remake, and that character is Ashley. I think Ashley is actually slightly better in the remake than she was in the original. I think she was actually great in the original. I actually think she was pretty sweet and likable in the original, and her voice actress was great.
Her name's Ashley Graham, the president's daughter.
But I'm glad in the remake she actually gets to do something as opposed to just being a damsel in distress. I mean, she most certainly wasn't completely useless in the original, but I think she was even far more useful in the remake and got a lot more things to do. Plus, her character development and relationship with Leon are far better developed. Also, I think it was more realistic of her to be actually afraid at first, the first time Leon saved her. So Ashley is the only character that I think is slightly better in the remake, but that is very fairly minor though, since as I said, I still think she was pretty likable in the original as well. So the final character I'll talk about is Lewis, whom is the only character that I think is pretty much unchanged. I mean, he certainly gets a lot more screen time in the remake, but that's pretty much it. He's the only character that I will go to say is pretty much unchanged. Most story details and characters I very much prefer in the original. Final thing I'll compare the two games is the replayability, and this is where I think they actually score a tie. I think I ultimately prefer the original, but if I wanted to do the replay of either one of them, I really think that would depend on my mood. Sometimes I would much prefer to play the original, probably most of the time actually, but there certainly are times where playing a remake with modern realistic graphics I would actually prefer. So replayability is the one thing where I think the two games tie up. That said, if I wanted to do a replay right now at least, I would very likely choose the original. I have too many video games in my backlog, so for now I'm taking a break from Resident Evil 4, but if I wanted to replay one right now, I would go with the original. So I guess they're almost tied up, but I guess the original slightly wins that round too. Resident Evil 4 Remake is a fantastic game, and I really regret I put it only at number 7 on my top 10 best video games of 2023. It truly should be in the top 5 or maybe even in the top 3. It's a fabulous game, and I really love its modern realistic graphics and a much more accessible gameplay. But ultimately, I don't think it can hold a candle to the original. So, original is the masterpiece, and original ultimately is a champion and wins this. Again, remake is amazing, but I just love the campy nature of the original, and also most of the story choices I think were far better in the original. Original is truly one of those video games where I'll go outright to call it a true masterpiece. So, ultimately, which one do I recommend? Well, if you're one of those people that's so into modern gaming and you can't get over and you just want modern realistic graphics, then Remake easily. I personally recommend both games very much, because as I've been saying, both video games are amazing and I very much would recommend to play both of them. at least to see how they compare, but if you could only play one of them, then again, if you're one of those people that can't get over older graphics, then I think Remake will probably be better for you. But if you're like me and you just say an actual good quality video game and actually care about truly good quality gaming, then I think original is your go-to. But thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for checking out my video on a Resident Evil 4 remake and original comparison. And this is literally one of my most special videos I've been making for you all. And thank you for checking out this video. Press the like button. Please subscribe this channel. Which Resident Evil 4 game do you prefer? And talk to you later. Bye!